All right, so assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we're today going to continue the other part of the evolution of Muslim thinking, and we're going to cover and continue covering the other references that a faqih considers in issuing a fatwa or in order to consider a new legislature, which is ijtihad. And we talked about al-maslaha al-mursala, and we said that when we're talking about al-maslaha al-mursala, we're looking at a different way of looking at the texts, where they're considering by looking at and looking through the light and in the lens of maqasid al-sharia, which are the general legislations, and not the general legislations, but the general maxims, legal maxims in Islam, and looking through that, they will issue in the light, in the lens of maqasid al-sharia, which basically are the sharia maxims in Islam, will consider a certain fatwa, or will consider a certain ruling based on the light of that. But there are certain things that must be in a maslaha or in a maslaha mursala, certain things that must be as before we consider that is the ruling by looking at certain benefits. But we're going to talk about that later on. Al-istihsan is the second part, al-urf and sadd al-dhara'i', qawl al-sahabi, and shar'u man qablina. We're just going to talk really fast about some of these things just because they relate to our life, and we have to understand when we look at the text, do we necessarily say, well, I've got a text, therefore this is the ruling in the text, and therefore this tells me halal or haram. So there are certain things, just like al-istihsan, where you can have a text literally noting a ruling relating something, but a rare ruling over a common ruling. So there's a common ruling. This is supposed to be a common text. This is supposed to be by default the ruling on a matter. But because of a rare incident of something that is not always going to happen, and that becomes a strong reason to why the scholars will consider, well, we don't want to say that let's apply the text, because in this situation we've got another side of it that is requiring us to look at the general picture. And when we say general picture, we're then looking at a rare instance in understanding the situation. So two sides, when we look at any incidents or any situation, we look at in-nas, we look at the text, and we also understand al-waqi', we understand the situation. And the third part, when we want to apply the text on the situation, the circumstance that we have, there is also maqasid al-sharia. We need to also look at the legal / sharia maxims and actually understand, do we necessarily apply the text in that situation, especially that the situation is and the circumstances are likely or less or different. So let's look at that, where you've got Umar ibn al-Khattab. He didn't enforce the had and the penalty of stealing, even though the nas is clearly there. The text was clearly saying that if somebody steals, well, we know that there is what the punishment is. Yet because there was a famine, that widespread famine, where people needed to protect their life, they needed to protect. So we've got DNAIM, people at the time, due to the famine, were considerate over protecting their lives. So this man that stole was really stealing not because they wanted some kind of prosperity or some kind of extravagance, but they were really considerate over preserving their life. So in that situation, Umar ibn al-Khattab, by looking at the waqi', by looking at the circumstance, looking at the situation, did not apply the text, because in the lens of maqasid al-sharia, in the lens of the maqasid al-sharia, which are the sharia maxims, DNAIM, that's why he basically said, well, we're not going to apply the text right now because istihsanan, because of that situation that is making us interpret the situation. By looking at the situation, this is helping us reinterpret the text for that particular situation. But you want to remember that when we're scrutinizing other texts, and this is not based on personal opinion, but we're actually using maqasid al-sharia, we're actually using the sharia maxims, and through that lens we're looking at the situation to issue a final fatwa. Let's give another part, which is when a woman, she needs to see a doctor, she needs to see an OB, she's getting a baby, or she's probably getting some kind of infection, and she clearly needs to see a doctor. The female doctor is not present, and there's only a male doctor. Well, she needs to see that doctor, because if right now she does not see a doctor, the baby can die, something can happen to the baby. We do have a text that tells us that no man is supposed to be seeing a woman's awrah. We know that part. But we're looking at the situation, we're looking at the circumstance, in the light of the Sharia maxims, is telling us, well, we need to protect this woman and the baby's life. So we will then consider istihsanan, we will then look at the text in the lens of maqasid al-sharia and the circumstance, and say, well, right now this woman can uncover in front of this male doctor because we need to preserve the baby's life. Now, maslaha al-mursala is slightly different, because with maslaha al-mursala, you're considering a certain benefit or interest. The benefit here is really referred to the benefit maqasid al-sharia. So it's not a personal benefit. We're not here talking about a benefit where I want to go through interest just to buy and consider a benefit, which is I need a home. All right, or I need a house, I need a nicer house, I need that. This is not the maslaha that we're talking about. The maslaha that we're talking about is the maslaha that relates to maqasid al-sharia. So for example, let's look at Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. He compiled the scattered records of the Quran in a single volume, and also waged a war on those that refused to pay zakah, even though generally speaking it wasn't done by the Prophet ﷺ, even though he was able to do it. The Prophet ﷺ was able to get the Sahaba and say, hey, let's combine the different records and the different documents that we had put out and laid out for the Quran, and let's put them all together. He didn't do that. But Abu Bakr as-Siddiq looked at the benefit down the road, and what that might lead to, or the good thing that it might lead to, and that's why he did something even though the Prophet ﷺ himself did not actually do. But here's one thing: when we want to speak about maslaha, there are many conditions, and as what makes a maslaha, what makes a benefit, and who regards the benefit. Number one, it should not contradict the text. All right, should not contradict the text. This is a little different than istihsan, or actually very different. It is to preserve the principles of Sharia. So the whole issue is really to preserve the principles of Sharia, i.e., which are remember the acronym that we were always using, which is DNAIM. Remember that part. To preserve the deen, the nas, the aql, the ird, the man. That you should memorize like your own name. Gotta always keep that in your life every single day. Just remember deen, nafs, aql, ird, man. Always. All right. And the other part is that it does not contradict an unchangeable ruling in Islam. What we mean by unchangeable ruling, which in Arabic we call them al-thawabit, meaning they don't change. They're absolute rulings. You can't change them due to a circumstance. And it does not contradict a more considerable benefit. So if we're looking at, for example, the nafs we consider that over the money. So we might pay more, for example, to preserve somebody's life. We might consider somebody's life over over the money and etc. It is a real needed benefit that Sharia considers, not a personal desire. Right. So we're here considering the real Sharia part, and it's not somebody's benefit in where it's making them feel that life is easier or somehow making their life feel better, different, and or even say, well, it takes off the stress off of me, and it makes me feel better because I'm going through some stress because I lost my mother or whatever it is. This is a personal issue that we don't consider maslaha mursala because you happen to feel some stress and then say, well, let's issue a fatwa, and because there needs to be a maslaha, there's that benefit that relates to me. And it's a public interest and not an individual need. So it has to be a public interest and not an individual need where it's just one person that relates to. So who's the person that looks in regards that benefit? It's really a person that is specialized in fiqh. He's the one that will look into these references and look and consider these established considerations, and then we'll say, well, based on this consideration, here's how we're going to understand the text and interpret the text or apply the text on the situation that we're in. The other part, which is al-urf. Now, culture, this is a very, what is the word that I could use? The most commonly misunderstood issue, I would say, because many times people would consider that culture is anti-Islam, or that culture and religion are two paradox. They're not actually in paradox. They're not, they're not against each other, because urf in general is to actually be something that is valued and something that is considered, because that makes the summary of people's experiences throughout the different times. And there's the geographical part, there's the economical part, there are a number of different issues that accumulated to have that particular group of people feel that this, based on our experience, served our relationship and the dynamics of our economy, social relations, the geographical area that might actually play a major role. So many different items can result and can be those different dynamics that can create a certain culture amongst a group of people. So in Islam, culture is not to be disregarded just because it's culture. In fact, religion or Islam itself considers culture as a reference we go back to. Reference, in other words, we respect the culture that people lived in and the experience that they had been working around. It's making their life easier, and we would look into it as a reference in order to define certain untold, untexted, if that is even a word, something that is not in the text, and then we would use al-urf, we would use culture in order to see what was their intention, how can we interpret the dynamics of the relationship, etc. And then we would use that as a reference to help us understand and help the Muslims understand through the lens of culture how to work with one another. So we would not negate or reject culture just because, oh, it's culture. No, it's not just culture. It is to be respected because these parts of people, they lived around culture, and it's one silent way. It's a silent way to help people deal with one another. So culture is actually a considerable side, and that's why when we look at culture, there are a number of sides that we would look into it. We would consider there's the urf al-qawli, there's the verbal tradition, in where maybe these group of people, they use a word to mean one specific side, and one specific word, and or sometimes a metaphor that they mean by it one specific thing, and we will consider that. And this is very common, that I would get people telling me that their husband probably told her, go to your family's house. And in certain cultures, go to your family's house just simply means divorce. In other cultures, go to your family's house might just mean, take some time off. So then we would consider what culture says. And here's the thing. In a lot of the different rulings, there are madhahib that issued fatwa based on the culture. So it later became, well, madhab Maliki would say this, madhab Hanafi would say that, and the reference is not necessarily based on a particular text. It was really a culture that was practiced then, and it became common within these groups of people. Let's take an example. Do working women pay a share of their income with their husband or to their husband to bring about financial stability within the household? There are almost 7 different opinions relating to that, and the reason why they had differences of opinions is really because there's no text. There is no text assigning that a woman should or should not pay within, especially if she's working, whether she should or she shouldn't pay and actually help, that with the expenses within the household. And that's why you had all these different opinions. It was really because there was a certain urf, practical tradition that people in certain places, they were governed by it, so they considered that as an evidence, or that as within that area, and then we would consider that culture, and then it becomes noted down in that madhab. So it becomes that issue that is generally known in a particular tradition, and it becomes the fatwa that particular madhab had regarded as the hukum shari, as the Islamic ruling. Now, one thing is that there are certain practices in certain countries or amongst certain people, that have certain backgrounds. Now, these certain practices, we don't negate everything. And especially when we're talking about marriage, this appears in marriage and also the fiqh of transactions. The fiqh of transactions and marriage is probably the most area, or the most 2 chapters that would always consider urf as a reference to go back to. So because as women we more deal with marriage and divorce, a lot of the different sisters would come to me and say, what does Islam say about that particular part? And I would say, well, there is no text to what it says to that particular part. We would go back to the urf. And that rises on the surface mostly when there is a dispute between the husband and the wife, in where I would always say, well, you go to a sheikh that is from your culture. Go to a sheikh and you resolve this issue between you and your husband to a sheikh that understands your culture, understands the background that you guys come from, and he would be the only person to explain the situation or even understand the implications of the wording or the different actions that happen between both of you. So in this situation, I always, because urf plays a very important role in the way we perceive right, wrong, and how we define manhood, how do we define womanhood, how we define woman's responsibilities and man's responsibilities, and the list goes on and on. That's why I always recommend marry from your own culture. Marry from your own culture, because urf is or even Islamically, urf is actually a reference. Urf is a reference. And if you married somebody that is from a different culture, you actually are speaking about a totally different reference. A totally different reference, and this can become a clash. Same thing if I were to not only speak about people from different cultures, but that is also the same when we're talking about if we have a different reference we go back to, then definitely the clash is going to be a result. Just like I was asked one time whether it was okay for a Sunni to marry a Shia, and I had said, well, I don't recommend it. I don't say it's haram, but I wouldn't recommend it because the different references, if it's not just cultural differences, but it is even textual references. So if we have textual differences and not only cultural differences, once you have textual references are totally different, where a Sunni would go back to al-Bukhari, but for a Shia, al-Bukhari is not acceptable. For a Shia, they'll go to al-Kafi, they'll go to all those different references. Well, that's when it creates, you got to go back to the foundation in order to see the result of it, and the result of it on our perceptions, the result of it in our behavior, the result of it in all those different sides and how they make up what we consider right, wrong, acceptable, not acceptable, and then it defines the relationship in a marriage or even outside of marriage. So when is culture considered? Culture would be considered are only to be considered if they do not contradict the text of the Quran and Sunnah. So if I have a particular text in the Quran or Sunnah, authentic Sunnah, then culture, we would not go back to it, and culture is not above the Quran and Sunnah. Because in general, considering tradition or culture over the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Sunnah is actually jahiliyyah. And here's a very common thing that people ask. Well, here in the US, polygamy, for example, or polygyny is considered as illegal. So does that mean because it's illegal here in the US that because we're supposed to respect the law of the land that we're living in, does that mean we would change the ruling of Islam and say, well, it's haram because we're supposed to respect the ruling and the laws of the land, and actually say that it's haram, and in that situation do ta'til and not apply the text? This, unfortunately, is a very common misunderstanding. The rule itself will still be valid. With what rule? That polygamy, which is marrying more than one wife, is actually considered halal. The situation and the circumstance that we're living in, where the law of the land is that it is illegal, it does not change the text. It doesn't change the text. It is illegal, but it will still be halal. It will always be halal, because this is qat'i thubut, qat'i dalala. This is something that is unchangeable within the text. You can't change it. You can't change it not to say maslaha mursalan. You can't change the rule. The rule is going to remain there. The rule of it being halal is going to be there regardless of the culture. Culture can mean a written culture like a constitution, or it can be a culture, an untold culture, but it is a practice known to being acceptable or not acceptable amongst a group of people. It being written, it doesn't make it as, yes, now here I've got a contradictory text, the text of the Quran with it contradicting the Constitution. We don't regard that contradictory, because Islam is above every constitution. Islam is above every single law. Yes, it is illegal, but that's their law. This, I've got a text in the Quran that's telling me that this is permissible. Therefore it is Islamically allowed, and therefore the relationship between a man and 3 or 4 wives is considered a halal relationship. Although yes, it is illegal. Yes, women should find ways to protect their rights in a legal way, especially during the time of fasad al-dhimam, during the time where many times people will not be pious to consider the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's really important to mention that we cannot say that, yes, the text says so, but because we have to respect the rule of the land, let's stop and do ta'til for this side of Islam. This is Jahiliyyah, straightforward Jahiliyyah, and a total misunderstanding of the text. And it is so sad to even see da'iyas or acclaimed da'iyas to issue fatwa such as that when there is no usul. And that's why when we're speaking, this is what we're studying right now, is actually right now called usul al-fiqh. When people lack, even if it's a da'iyah, lack the fiqh, ma'rifatul usul, and knowing the usul, you will see those common slips that will go totally in total contradiction with Islam. Now there's the other part, which is blocking the means of evil. Sadd al-dhara'a. Sadd al-dhara'a, it's some scholars said that it was like 2/3 of the Sharia. But how do we understand when we're blocking the means of fitna, and it most likely will happen? Now, every single situation, how far can you go? Well, let's see, just an application, just so we understand. When we look at Sadd al-dhara'a, look at women when in Saudi Arabia there were laws that were issued and fatwa that women were not supposed to be driving cars. And they depended on Sadd al-dhara'a. It went that far and said, well, to block the means of evil, women going out, whatever the reason, all these different things that they had said, to block the means of evil, therefore women, it's haram for women to drive. All right. Now the other part, which is here's a question or a comment. Somebody said, because we reside in a culture where polygamy is illegal, should imams, Muslim leadership speak out against polygamy within the American Muslim community as a constitution illegality, not as an Islamic ruling? Discourage polygamy rather than speak against it. So here's the thing, is that number one, this is not just new. I love the quote, or I loved what you had said, to discourage polygamy in order to, let me say, in order to somehow, be on the side or in parallel with the law, it actually has a number of things. Number one is that the situation in Islam regarded it as permissible because of the different inclinations that people have, and it can solve a lot of different problems, and it's more of a smaller group that will make you benefit and make use of that. But there are some scholars that did not recommend polygamy, and especially in the 6th or 7th year Hijrah, and they regarded that it was because of fasad al-dhimam, a different perspective. They said it was because people were not at the piety level of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, and that they were likely more like they're likely to commit aggression and actually and commit injustices, because the ayat were actually saying that if you fear that you won't be just, then marry one. When do you say if you fear you won't be just? When there's a higher chance of becoming unjust or committing injustices. So they said, well, here we're more likely to commit these injustices, and that was something that was told to the Sahaba, that they are more likely to commit injustices in a polygamous marriage. Then therefore, when we have gone further away and distant ourselves from Islamic practices, then therefore we should consider even more taqwa and not actually get into polygamous marriage. But no scholar ever said that it was haram, because it's an actual text. فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُمْ. It's an actual text that is considering it as halal. All right. So should the scholars in the Muslim community actually speak against polygamy, I think it will bring about a total misunderstanding a total misunderstanding to the majority. And right now we're seeing LGBT actually changing different laws in order to promote those illicit actions for Muslims to sing the tune, to sing the tune of the Constitution when other people are working against what was the Constitution at one time, and get different quote unquote privileges outside of even the fitrah, outside of even the Constitution, etc., and finally get it. And the Muslims right now working against the legalization of polygamy, I think, is not going to bring any benefit, because it will just change more to distance the Muslims away from Islam, and it will make them feel that they have to adapt, with a new culture, which is the Constitution, the culture, the American culture, and the list goes on and on. This type of adaptation has a price to it. The price to it is distancing ourselves from the wala, from our support to the Sharia. And that's the dangerous part about it. So it's not that people are actually going in huge numbers going for polygamy. What I fear of when we're speaking against it, or if we are to speak against it, what I fear of is that people will adapt to distancing themselves away from halal things that were mentioned in the Quran, in order to seem fit in, adapt to the non-Muslim culture, etc., and feel that, oh, we have to be like everybody else, even if we are here distancing ourselves away from Islam. And that's the understanding that the majority is going to get. And this is really dangerous, because we're already getting people, the masses of the Muslims are already so influenced, indoctrinated with the liberal lifestyle, and that liberal lifestyle is right now becoming a problem. Our problem is not with polygamy. Our problem is with the liberal indoctrination. So if we're going to ask imams to speak against polygamy, we're already fighting and battling a major fitna. The major fitna is liberalism, not polygamy. Polygamy, very few people can actually afford it. Very few people are going for it. Not that many. I know within probably the African American community, there's a large number within the African American Muslim community, a few from the Arab, mainly in the Gulf, and a few from the Levant, Syria, but usually it's hidden and nobody's talking about it, and it's to speak against it is going to bring in more harm, which is trying to adapt with the non-Muslim liberal culture than actually the actual thing. And it's not like we're getting all those cases. We're getting more harm from the liberal lifestyle and that indoctrination than polygamy. The number of people that are practicing polygamy are, just really few people. All right, now all Sharia rulings are based on this rule, which is sadd al-dhara'i. Everything in Islam, if you look at from the least sin to the major sin, all the lemam, or the minor sins, the reason why they are considered sins, it is really to block the means of the larger evil, which is the major sin. So when we look at sadd al-dhara'i, we see that in the Quran it was indicating sadd al-dhara'i as a Sharia maxim, in where, for example, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and forbid, of course, insult not those whom the disbelievers believe in beside Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, don't insult their gods, so that they will not insult Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wrongfully. Now, you could see that this type of reference and this type of phrase, meaning that it's telling you so that they won't do it. In general, is it permissible to insult those gods that they are worshiping? Well, it's supposed to be permissible. Why? Because that's a fake god anyways. But Islam was telling you, no, don't do it, because it will lead to a bigger harm, even though the actual act of insulting those gods is supposed to be halal because they're fake gods anyways. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling you, no, 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 no. Don't do it, not because of the actual thing, but because of the result that it, or the consequence that it might lead to. Well, that's not only in that, but that's the same thing where the Prophet ﷺ also also said about the munafiqeen. He knew their names, he knew who was causing all the trouble, and he knew who was causing the division. But the Prophet ﷺ just said, I was worried that people were going to say Muhammadun yaqtul ashabah, that people were going to misunderstand, and the vast majority of the people out there are going to think that Muhammad ﷺ is killing his own companions, and then people are going to be afraid to enter the religion. So that's the same thing, and we're considering in the long run, and the outcomes of a certain behavior is part of understanding the ruling, and that you can't separate the consequence from the actual part. And that's exactly what ISIS did. What ISIS did is because they lacked fiqh, they didn't understand that you can't just look at the text without looking at the result of the text. So extremism is really when you just look at the text and without looking at the outcomes and the consequences and how to apply النص على الواقع, how to apply the text on the situation, the circumstances that we are living in. And number three, in the lens of maqasid al-sharia, in the lens of the sharia maxims. So when we look at a wrong understanding, most extremism happens really because people are not understanding how text is applied on the circumstance or the situation, and how we have to also look at the consequences of different things. Now, looking at the consequences, speaking of that, right now, before, let me say it that way, before, the scholars didn't have the statistics and different studies and all those different things in order to say, well, this is what the outcome might look like. But right now, scholars of fiqh will, in different fiqh councils, they will invite the different scholars in probably medicine, in economy, in statistics, in different areas, in order to see what studies have shown or what studies have told us that the consequence will look like if we are to do such a thing, or what are the consequences in the long run if we are to say that this is halal, or looking at the practices that we are seeing around us. So they will use when we say blocking the means, that would mean that in the long run we will use those tests to see in the long run what have studies shown that if we are to do this, what is likely to happen. And then they'll use those statistics to look at it in order to say haram, halal, etc. So we do consider those sides. Now, we want to keep in mind that even when we say sadd al-dhara'a, then we would consider, remember, a number of different things, which is a Shatibi, one of the Maliki scholars. He said we will look at the rules. Is it leading to haram da'iman? Is it always leading to haram? Then if always it leads to haram, then that would mean that it would be haram. If it leads to haram adatan, most of the times, then that would also mean it's haram, but we would also consider certain conditions to make sure that it doesn't go off track. And then we would say ghaliban, and then we would say sometimes. So sometimes it leads to it. Then we would consider the rules based on that lens. How often is it? And then we would ask the scholars in different fields to tell us, well, how often, if somebody has a mental illness, how often do they understand or do they not understand what they're going through? So we would use those psychological tests, those economical studies, those medical studies, etc., in order to help us understand, when we're talking about a ruling, the impact the impact it has in the long run, and how to apply in nas and the situation in nas, which is the text, and also al-waqa'. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ يَبْغُونَ وَمَنْ أَحْسَنُ مِنَ اللَّهِ حُكْمًا لِقَوْمٍ يُوقِنُونَ. أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ يَبْغُونَ. Do they seek the jahiliyyah? The jahiliyyah is when the person rules by their own inclinations. All right, يبغون ومن أحسن من الله حكما لقوم يوقنون. So, أفحكم الجاهلية, are they considering the ruling of jahiliyyah, their own inclinations, over the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So in that situation, we always keep that in mind, that when we speak of rulings, we should not consider own inclinations. So here's the thing. When we look at those that we had mentioned before, those were the references, right? But when we speak of a regulation in Islam, so we looked at those references that they would go back to, but now we need to look at it from a different perspective. And that perspective is basically the ruling in Sharia. But I would like to keep note here is that yes, we will say obligatory, sunnah, mubah, makruh, haram, but guess what? The Hanafis will actually use sometimes different terms and different definitions to something. So when we look at obligatory, fard or wajib, for the Hanafi, they'll use a different term and they'll even have a different definition. Well, why have a different definition? So they'll say, well, it's a text ordering, and one is rewarded for doing something, and a person is at sin for leaving it. Okay, so obligatory, fard or wajib, the text is giving you an order. It's telling you that you will be rewarded for doing, and you will be at sin for leaving. So what does that mean? So for the Jumhur, majority of scholars, all right, the majority of scholars, they'll say it's the same thing. Fard is the same thing as wajib. It's the same word, all right? But for Hanafi, they will say no, it's not the same thing. Fard, the 5 daily prayers, but wajib is like Salat al-Witr. How is Salat al-Witr different? Well, they said Salat al-Witr, I've got a text that says, أوتروا فإنها سنة أبيكم إبراهيم. Here's an order. It's giving me an order, أوتروا. It's an imperative verb telling me you must do this. But yes, it's not as a command or an obligation as the 5 daily prayers, because that is more of قطعي الدلالة, قطعي الثبوت. We've got قطعي الثبوت and قطعي الدلالة. What does that mean? All right, we're going to look at what is called thubut and dalala. All right, so thubut would mean that I have something that is, in terms of reference wise, we are very sure it is one word to say for it. قطعي الثبوت. It is very authentic. All right, absolutely authentic from a source wise. Dalala would mean the connotation, or not connotation, but the interpretation. Like when we look at those words, is the phrase an absolute word where it cannot get more than one meaning, or is that word tahtamil, meaning there is a possibility that it can have other meanings. It can have other meanings. It can have other interpretations. There's no way that you cannot interpret it. Or if it's قطعي الدلالة, if it's قطعي, you've got two things. Let's do this. All right. You've got الثبوت, meaning the reference wise, and you also have الدلالة. The dalala itself, meaning the word itself, it can have one absolute meaning. You can't say that you can have a different interpretation. That's قطعي الدلالة. It says khamr is haram. Clearly, it's not talking about any kind of a grape juice or any kind of a pop or any kind of a coke. It's actually talking about khamr, which is that particular matter. But if it's ظني الدلالة, meaning that the meaning itself can have multiple interpretations, multiple meanings. One word can have multiple meanings, and where scholars will have different opinions on whether it means that or it means this. All right, so in that situation where it's not only the meaning, but it can also mean, are we looking at the reference itself? And it is absolutely telling me as an order that there is no other reference to change the amount of obligation on it. What does that mean? So then I would have in the text something that is going to be a qarina. What is a qarina? A qarina is another part of the phrase that is, let's give an example. It makes it easier for us to understand. Look at Surah Al-Jumu'ah. So Surah Al-Jumu'ah was telling us, فَإِذَا قُضِيَتِ الصَّلَاةُ فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ. If the prayer had been completed, فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ, then spread about in the land in order to seek businesses, to work, etc. But here's the question. فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ, does that make going out after prayer to go and work and go to your business, does that make it obligatory? No. Why? Because generally speaking, there is another part of the story, which is that فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ, working in business in itself is mubah. All right? That's in itself is halal. All right? So the ayah saying فَانْتَشِرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ, it doesn't make that imperative verb intashiru, it does not make it obligatory. All right? Now let's move on. So you've got obligatory, you've got sunnah. When we say something is sunnah, meaning that the text is recommending, not obligating, but it is just recommending. What led it go from the level of obligatory to a sunnah? There would be a qarina. There would be a qarina. What is the qarina? The qarina, remember, something within the qarina can be the context itself, or can be the text itself is not giving me a firm obligation. All right? That's why when we study fiqh and you study Islamic studies, there is no way that you can study Islamic studies and even, let me say, mutabaharfi and study it at depth if you do not know Lugha Arabiya. There is no way. Because in order to know and be able to issue a fatwa, you have to know, does this in Lugha Arabiya make a qarina or not? Does this, the context itself, does the text itself? And of course, when we say text, we're going to go back to the grammar, to the Arabic grammar to see what this means. And this is our problem. A lot of the dua right now are actually not specialized in Islamic studies, but specialized, I would say, studied the surface of Islamic studies. And because they lack the ma'rifah, the deep knowledge in Lugha Arabiya, that's where all the chaos happened. The chaos happened because a large number of them studied Islamic studies and read it in English and studied it in English, and then it ends up getting into that misinterpretation, getting into that misunderstanding because Lugha Arabiya itself, عجمة اللسان. Because of Lugha Arabiya itself, that brings in a dakhan. What is a dakhan? A dakhan means murky. But here, a dakhan means that murkiness, that murky understanding in understanding Islam, and that gets things a lot of times lost. And this is what's causing a lot of the fatawa that we're getting right now in dua, misrepresenting Islam. All right, so now we look at the sunnah. When we say something is a sunnah, we look at the text itself. Is it recommending? Is it obligating? What is it doing? And then we would say, if this is a sunnah, then the person is rewarded for doing it and not sinned for leaving, unless the person is actually denying. So this is wrong right there. Unless the person is denying that this is a sunnah. But when we're looking at denying a sunnah or mocking a sunnah, that is if it was proven to actually have an authentic resource. So if somebody, for example, were to mock, wearing a beard, all right? And we know that we've got a hadith that speak about the beard, that speak about it as a sunnah, that the Prophet ﷺ had talked about it, that this is part of the sunnah. This can be at the level of kufr, because you're mocking something the Prophet ﷺ praised. This would be at the level of kufr. But if, let's say, somebody said, well, I don't believe that people should use siwak and let them use toothbrushes, because the siwak is a very primitive way of doing the teeth, and all the plaque is going inside this oud al-arak, inside this arak branch, and it's going to just accumulate inside, and it's disgusting. All right, let's say somebody said that. It won't lead to kufr, because what they thought, they considered that was primitive, although they didn't mock the fact that it was something that was practiced by the Prophet ﷺ, but they just probably considered, well, I've got a better way, which is the toothbrush, and you can wash it, and you can make, put all that toothpaste with mint flavor, and it's giving you a good breath, etc. All right, that is not mocking the sunnah, but it is on the borderline. It is on the borderline, and in that situation, that borderline can actually lead the person, and may lead the person to mocking other parts of the sunnah without them realizing. Because if you're, and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّهَا مِن تَقْوَى الْقُلُوبِ. Whoever honors the rituals of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is an indication, and it indicates the taqwa in the taqwa, the piety in people's hearts. So when we look at the situation right now where people are trying to fit in a liberal culture, and an American, whatever you want to call it, and all the secular lifestyle, and trying to get away and trying to change Islam in order to fit in, this is really a reflection of the diseases in the heart that is actually in the ummah. It's like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent you the best of the culture. So here, when we look at sunnah, it's really important to consider and remember that there's a sunnah mu'akkada and sunnah ghayr mu'akkada. The difference is that we have something that the Prophet ﷺ did and barely left, and something the Prophet ﷺ barely did, but he did do it at times. So we've got sunnah mu'akkada, just like siwak. The Prophet ﷺ was doing it, he was seen, and he did recommend it, and it becomes he barely left it, and he was constantly doing it. In fact, he said in the hadith, لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك عند كل صلاة. If only I didn't want to burden the Muslim ummah, the nation, I would have ordered them to use siwak after every salah. دبر كل صلاة, after every salah. غير مؤكدة, or even غير مؤكدة, we're talking about غير مؤكدة, meaning that the Prophet ﷺ didn't always do it, just like the sunnah before Salat al-Asr. Before Salat al-Asr, there's the other part which is mubah, all right, meaning the text is giving you the option. Yesterday I was asked a question about polygamy, or polygyny, which is marrying a second wife, and somebody said, well, my father doesn't want me to get married, but I want to get married, and he's insisting that I don't. And I said, although yes, it is permissible, and even getting married to a second wife, yes, the ayah says فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ, meaning marry the women that you desire. Okay, so clearly it doesn't necessarily put a condition that there has to be the wife being ill or barren, or etc. It didn't put a condition, and here it says مَا طَابَ. It just left it very very open like that. Then therefore it is halal, but not every halal means go do it. Because halal, you would have to study the circumstance, you would have to study the situation that is surrounding that particular situation, and then you would say, well, is it best for me to do, or is it not best for me to do? All right, so not because something is mubah, it doesn't mean go do it. You would have to go look further and remember to use your wisdom. And using the wisdom means understanding the consequence of such an action, or even the decision, the consequence of that decision, and how it might lead to negative or positive results. And that's wisdom. So there's also the part which is makruh. So the text, what we mean by text is not an SMS, but what we mean by text is basically Quran and Sunnah. It is disliking. It's disliking, meaning it's considering that, no, don't do it. But it didn't give an imperative like haram, and it said, don't do it. All right? And that's why for the Hanafi, they would say, well, there's makruh tanzih and there's makruh tahrim. Makruh tahrim, like it's makruh, it's disliked, but it is closer to haram than halal. And this one, makruh tanzih, it is disliked, but it's closer to halal than haram. And that they'll go into details, what is tanzih and tahrim, and is it really encouraging, discouraging, what do we mean by that? All right, and there's the other part which is haram. But you want to keep in mind is that in order to issue any fatwa, to call something obligatory, mubah, haram, we would need to use lugha arabiya. We would have to go back to the text and analyze the text and see, is this giving me an order? Is there a qarina? Sarafat min kada ila kada. Is there a qarina that led to the ruling go from the degree of from such a level to another level, and then we would consider that. Now, when we say something is haram, there would be a text that we would go back to that's forbidden. But here's one thing, is that the text itself, if, for example, it's giving me a nahi, it's forbidding me from doing something, it's prohibiting a matter, there are different terms. It doesn't have to say halal, haram. It doesn't always use that word. It can use, for example, calling it a name, such as calling it fahisha, or it can talk about a punishment as a result. That if somebody does that, then there's going to be, the result is a punishment, or the result is a curse, or the result is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's anger at you, etc., get to you, etc. All these different things would actually mean that something is haram. So it doesn't necessarily have to use the word hurrimat alaykum such and such. It doesn't have to use that term. In fact, for example, take zina. It actually says وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Don't even get near zina. And it also talked about khamr, and it said فَاجْتَنِبُوا. Stay away from it. That's even a bigger word and a more let me call it a stronger term than actually the word hurrimat, than the word haram, because فَاجْتَنِبُوا, don't even get near it. Not only don't do it, but don't even approach. Meaning, stay totally distant even from it. Don't even think of approaching. Not only not consuming, but don't even approach that area. If it's a table, if it's a restaurant that's serving this, don't even approach that area. You don't belong there as a Muslim. All right. So it is 6:04 right now, and next week, we'll be talking about, well, how was fiqh formed? Now, here goes the butter, because when we're talking about how it's formed, then we're going to get into speaking about the different eras and what led to our era today. What led to our era today, and we're going to talk about during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, were there differences of opinions, and of course the most important question is, well, if they've got all these references and they've got all these dawabat, all these regulations in issuing a fatwa, why would they go in differences of opinions? Well, in order to answer that one, were there differences of opinions during the time of the Prophet ﷺ? How did the Prophet ﷺ resolve it? Did the Prophet ﷺ necessarily consider that every single difference of opinion is a way to division, a way to disunity? Or did he look at it from a different perspective and allow it or not? We'll also talk about the different eras and the different times, and how looking at the text can be studied differently, and how later that resulted into a major clash. We'll also be talking about that, inshallah, and we'll talk about the story of fiqh and how it began and we'll also talk about my favorite part. This is my favorite part, the madhahib. I hope we have time next week, but we'll be talking about those different sides. So if there are any questions before I end, go ahead. Allah barik fiki wa iyyakum wa iyyakum. We will be putting this up, inshallah. Finally, I've got a YouTube channel, so I got that fixed. And I was able to figure it out, so we'll be putting this on YouTube, inshallah. And please subscribe, that way it'll allow us to make live on YouTube, inshallah. All right, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So whether on Facebook or whether in person. Well, alhamdulillah, I guess the lecture was clear. I hope it wasn't complicated. I know these matters can sometimes be hard to focus on, and especially if you're doing something online, sometimes you just, you want the person to be in front of you in order to do that visual communication, especially for those visuals, to do the visual communication. So we just try using PowerPoint, and hopefully that will fill the gap of that person to person, actual communication that we could use. But khair, inshallah, hopefully this pandemic will go away, and hopefully inshallah things will go good. And jazakumullah khairan, everybody, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Do I recommend any sources on other legal maxims in fiqh? That's a very good question. There is, it depends on if you want it in Arabic or in English. I will be bringing that book up, inshallah, because I do know that if you read Arabic, there are a number of books on maqasid al-sharia. I will bring those next week, and I'll give you the links to some of those books if you read in Arabic. In English, there are a number of books that try to tackle that, as I think, right now it's not coming to my mind. I know that Dr. Hatim al-Hajj translated some books relating to that. I know that for sure. He actually translated some books, and I do know that one of the most important books was actually written by an Indian scholar. I'll have to go back to those books and actually give you a whole list of them, especially if you speak in Arabic. They're quite hard to read, but I think you'll love them. Inshallah. All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.